breathe in. So just try to stay present with the breath in whatever way you feel is conducive for your mind. Some people pay attention to the sensation at the tip of the nose. Some people pay attention to the sensation as the abdomen rises and falls as you breathe in, as you breathe out. Other people just have a general awareness of the breath coming in, kind of expanding the body. And then as it goes out, the body contracting. Or you can count the breaths. There are so many ways that we can work with our breath as a meditation object. Just find what works for you and just settle into that meditation. Again, we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes. And then I'll come in and lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation. Tonight we've been talking a lot about our intention, our motivation. We want to start by setting a very positive intention for being here. I'd like to invite you to just bring to mind a vision of what you would like this world to be. Environment and the beings that live in this world all in harmony. Everything growing, prospering, and free of many of the difficulties and problems that we're currently seeing in our environment. And just imagine a world like that. All the beings in the environment they live in are in this ideal state of balance, state of harmony. Your deepest wish for this world and everything that's in it. While we might not be able to make that a reality, we nonetheless set the intention, the motivation to be here, to plant the seeds within our own minds and be able to also share those with others so that we can move in that direction. our actions, and come from that deep motivation of creating a world just like that. Everything in harmony, everything balanced, everything beautiful. And hold that intention of being here for the whole wide world with all the beings in it. In this way, everything we do will become the cause for creating a result that is in line with that, is moving in that direction. Letting you open your eyes and we'll begin. Okay, so I've actually done this talk a number of times, and each year when I revisit it, of course, we're further along in what's happening in this world. So it's maybe in some ways a little bit harder sometimes to work with this topic, but nonetheless, I think it's a very important one. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to share these teachings with you. Actually, the initial inspiration for doing this talk was reading a book that I'll mention a couple of times. I even got a few passages from it that I'm sharing, called Active Hope. Some of you may have read this book. It was published, I think, back in 2012 or something. I think they just came out with a 10th anniversary edition of it. Active Hope was by Joanna Macy, who is a really important environmental activist in our world, also a Tibetan Buddhist. So she shares many of the same views that we all work with here at Shanti Buddha Center. But she wrote this book with a man named Chris Johnston. And if I have some time, I'll show you a little video of her telling a wonderful story that's kind of where we want to be in terms of our thinking about the crises that we're facing and how to work with that. So let me go ahead and do a little bit of a slideshow and share some things with you. I want to start with a quote from His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who also has been working quite tirelessly to try to encourage people to work on environmental issues. There was a book he published with Greta Thunberg very recently, many of you know or have heard of. In a talk he gave called Universal Responsibility in the Environment, he says, our ancestors viewed the earth as rich and bountiful, which it is. Many people in the past also saw nature as inexhaustibly sustainable, which we now know is the case only if we care for it. Whereas this is, of course, the view that we're trying to understand is how did we get into this place of using the resources of this planet and doing so many things that have unfortunately damaged our environment. Each time I've done this for the last several times, this talk, I try to update this in terms of where we're at. If you go to a site that's called climate.nasa.gov, NASA keeps track of all these things and they annually update them. Now, these numbers don't mean a whole lot, but with the explanation that's underneath, it gives a feeling for what that means now. Carbon dioxide is at 422 parts per million. That sounds like really insignificant, right? 422 to a million. But as it says here, since the onset of industrial times in the 18th century, human activities have raised atmospheric CO2 by 50%, meaning the amount of carbon dioxide is now 150% of its value in 1750. So we can see that this is definitely an indicator of what has happened through the industrial age that we live in and all of what has transpired through the use of various resources and what have you. Global temperature. This is a big concern. Here we are in September experiencing heat that probably is not normal for this time of year at all. What has become normal in many parts of the world is much, much hotter. Global temperatures are up 1.1 degrees centigrade since 1880. That's about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So again, we know from what we've been experiencing and these records that have been broken this summer in particular, that this is not normal. This is our new normal, if you will. So again, the year 2020, I've got a little error in there. It says source NASA. I must have somehow missed getting that out of there. The year 2020 statistically tied with 2016 for the hottest year on record since record keeping began in 1880. I think we had a couple of hottest days ever this summer, right? I think the world temperature was way beyond what it normally should be. Arctic sea ice extent. This is down 12.6%, about 13% per decade. Arctic sea ice reaches its minimum extent each September. September Arctic sea ice is now shrinking at a rate of 13% per decade. compared to its average extent during the period of 1981 to 2010. So again, these are all indicators that we're not going in the right direction. I'm not trying to depress you, just wake us up to the reality. Ice sheet is down 424 gigatons. A gigaton is a unit of explosive energy or force. And this is a pretty significant number. I found this kind of interesting. The last time I did this talk last September down in Florida for our center in Deerfield Beach, it was 427. So it's down actually a little bit, but maybe that's because we're losing so much ice that there's not as much ice to lose. I hate to think about that, but so again, NASA's GRACE and GRACE follow-on satellites show that the land ice sheets in both Antarctica and Greenland have been losing mass since 2002. So this is again, big significance. And of course, it's causing the sea level to rise, right? Sea level is up 4 inches since 1993. This is caused primarily by two factors related to global warming: the added water from the melting ice sheets and the glaciers, and the expansion of seawater as it warms. And of course, we were hearing things about southern Florida, where the temperature of the water was 100 degrees this summer, right? You know, and the effect it's having on sea life and what have you, coral and what have you, is outrageous. But what's happening in terms of the sea level rising as well because of the warmed water is also significant. Ocean warming is up 345 zettajoules. A zettajoule is a unit of thermal energy. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know these things, but it's up that since 1955. The last 10 years were the ocean's warmest decade since at least the 1800s. The year 2022 was the ocean's warmest recorded year, and I'm betting 2023 will surpass it based on what we're seeing tonight, and saw the highest global sea level. Okay, so those are some statistics that we can kind of be aware of. And the question that we're going to entertain tonight is, what role can Buddhism, and specifically we as Buddhist practitioners, or those of you who maybe just have an interest in Buddhism, I don't know everyone in the room in terms of your Buddhist background, how do we use Buddhist teachings to confront this unprecedented crisis? Sorry, I'm having difficulty talking to you. We need a drink of water. All right. So what I'd like to do first is kind of take a little look and just introduce some teachings that many of you have had before. Kind of getting us into that is His Holiness's introduction to this topic. Since negligence of the environment, which has resulted in lots of harm to the human community, came about by ignorance of the very special importance of the environment, I think it's very important, first of all, to instill this knowledge within human beings. This is kind of the first thing, is we as Buddhist practitioners should really be aware of these statistics of what's happening with the world around us. You know, we have this feeling like sometimes Buddhism is all about, well, you know, I have to be concerned about my internal world and working on my own mind, and don't need to be so concerned about the external world. But the reality is that the external world is a product of our minds, is something related to us. And so it is important that we don't neglect that. I was reading an article in Tricycle magazine a couple of years ago, and it was talking about that concept. I think in other theistic traditions, you have that idea, right? Of the earth just being kind of a holding place until you get to heaven. Well, in Buddhism, we think of it as sort of samsara, as having an unsatisfactory existence here. And so there can tend to be that same thing in Buddhism, where we look at the world that we live in as kind of something we want to discard. And it's not something we want to discard, it's something that is vital to the life of so many beings, the well-being of so many people. So this is one first thing, is just to have the awareness, the understanding that knows what's going on, that we aren't being negligent of what will actually be of value for us to know and for us to, instill in others. So if we think about the earth, he says, this is Thich Nhat Hanh now, a wonderful book called Love Letter to the Earth, passed away. Thich Nhat Hanh passed away, I think last year or early this year. I can't remember the date. I think it was last year. He says, we think about the earth as just the environment around us. We experience ourselves and the earth as separate entities. We may see the planet only in terms of what it can do for us. We need to recognize that the planet and the people on it are ultimately one and the same. You know, this is something that, again, is also an important perspective that Buddhism holds, is the understanding that the environment that we live in is created by the beings in it. It is a product of our karma. We're going to talk about that a little bit shortly, but the idea is that if we want to change things, yes, we do need to take actions, but we also need to change our minds. The internal environment and the external environment are a reflection of each other. So why we are experiencing what's going on in this world is due to our own minds having gotten carried away with greed, attachment, and all the things that have led to many of these conditions that we're experiencing. So let's carry on with some additional insights that I think Buddhism can offer to framing all of this. Essentially, as the screen says, this is pointing to the concept of interdependence, which is one of the primary Buddhist teachings upon which we rely. And we have this idea that everything is in a web of interconnection. In fact, Thich Nhat Hanh used this wonderful word, interbeing, the fact that things cannot exist without other factors. Of course, this is one of the deepest truths that Buddhism has as well, is this understanding of dependent origination or dependent arising, that everything is arising on the basis of other factors. So if we have that understanding, and Thich Nhat Hanh would use the example of a piece of paper. So he says, when you see a piece of paper, you shouldn't just see the paper and kind of that end product. You should see the trees that contributed to making that paper, and the sunlight that allowed the trees to grow, and the rain that allowed the moisture to be there for the tree to grow, all the various things that contributed to it. Because this is what we are involved in. And Buddhism, again, has a very deep understanding of this concept of interdependence. At this causal level, that nothing is kind of there independently. Things don't just appear in our world. Again, they're the product of a variety of causes and conditions. So this is, again, one of the truths that we can come to rely upon. And as we're going to see, this is really one of the two main points that we're really going to focus on in terms of having a good understanding of the world that we live in, and of course, our heart reaction to it, as we say in the title of this Ecology in the Human Heart. And we also have this amazing capacity to be able to use our compassion, our love for beings and what have you, to change our actions and change the world that we live in. So in Buddhism, we need to definitely keep in mind this idea of interdependence. Let me put another screen up there. In Buddhism, the deeper investigation into interdependence also finds that we affect the outer environment through the inner environment, something I've already touched on. So thus, we need to understand that deeper role that our minds play in creating the causes for what we are experiencing in our environment. Why is the environment in the way it is? As I said earlier, because of the state of our minds and what we are doing. This leads us to the Four Noble Truths, which I want to just touch on very briefly because it's such a core teaching in Buddhism. And it really does frame very well, what we are looking at. And this can, of course, be at a more ultimate level. That's how it was initially taught. This was the Buddha's first teaching. Upon attaining enlightenment, he essentially said there are four truths that I'm going to speak to, and that these are the reality of, first of all, what you are dealing with, which are the first two truths, and how you can get out of this predicament. And of course, we can get out of this individually. This is how it happens, is each of us individually working on attaining some freedom. But then we can also help others to do the same. So I'm going to take that off screen just because I don't like to keep the slide up there too long, but I'll come back to it if I need to. But essentially, we have this first noble truth, which is the truth of dukkha. Dukkha, I like to use instead of the word suffering, which is how it's often translated. Because dukkha, as the Sanskrit word, has a deeper connotation, saying that essentially we are dealing with an entire realm of unsatisfactoriness, dissatisfaction. And there are, of course, causes to that. That's the second noble truth, the truth of the origins or causes of dukkha. Dukkha doesn't come from anywhere. Again, this concept of interdependence plays out in these four truths. We have this state that we are in of everything being somewhat unsatisfactory, never finding any real peace that's lasting, any real deep happiness. Why? Because we create the causes for that type of situation. The causes are, of course, in our own mind primarily. They're in our mind in terms of the deepest level is the ignorance that is not grasping reality correctly. But moreover, the actions that we create on the basis of afflicted states that arise from that ignorance. All of this gives rise to this cycle of existence as samsara is often defined. So in Buddhism, of course, we have a belief in rebirth, that we've been cycling from life to life since beginningless time. It doesn't have to be this way. And that's, of course, what the last two truths are pointing to. The truth of the cessation of dukkha. The Buddha says that there can be an end. There can definitely be cessation in terms of ridding ourselves of the causes of that, and thereby the experience will be gone. This is pointing to the fact of kind of nirvana. We often talk about samsara and nirvana, these two states that essentially one is where we are, the other is where we would ideally like to be, is to have that freedom and liberation. And then, of course, that's possible through the fourth noble truth, the path that leads to them. So the Buddha taught this throughout his entire career. His 45 years of teaching, he was essentially teaching on this structure of trying to give beings primarily the information about the fourth noble truth. How do you get out of this situation? But he nonetheless had to teach the first one. That's why we spent a little time at the beginning of tonight looking at the reality of what we're looking at in our world. We have to have that acceptance of how things are, really know that we're in a state that's unsatisfactory. Again, we're not going to get into everything that is involved in these sorts of teachings at a deeper level, but to understand that the situation we're in arises from what we call contaminated karma, which are the actions that we engage in under the influence of these delusions, these afflictions, these states of mind that are not healthy for us, that are distorted. And that's because of the root delusion. The root delusion is ignorance, specifically not seeing the true nature of reality, especially in regard to ourselves, the I or the person. Again, this is like a huge teaching. I could teach on the Four Noble Truths all weekend, and I'm not going to spend that much time on them, but this is the context for understanding why we're in the situation that we're in. Everything that we experience is a product of this causal chain. Starts with our fundamental ignorance, gives rise to delusions, then gives rise to actions, karma. And by karma, we don't mean just what we do verbally or physically, we even mean mental karma, the thoughts that we have, and so on. The greed, the desire, all of these things that play a role. Now, to cease it, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to hit that twice. To cease dukkha, in Buddhism, we talk about a threefold path, what are often called the three higher trainings, which means that we first have to engage in morality. Morality is the foundational level. And this is where we can see that, again, why we're experiencing what we are is because of immorality, of not actually attending to the law of cause and effect, karma, actually creating the causes to experience more suffering, to compound our suffering. And then, of course, after decreasing the misconduct that will be ideal to get that foundation, we then need to practice concentration, which does calm the mind and the delusions to some degree, but it doesn't get rid of it. We have to engage in the higher training of wisdom. And of course, wisdom has many dimensions. Here, at the deepest level, we're talking about the wisdom that sees the nature of reality, that cuts through that. So again, this is the context of understanding it. But as I said, I mean, even just the level of conventional wisdom can play a role in terms of at least addressing some of what we need to do in order to abandon the suffering that we're experiencing in this world, to at least diminish it or decrease it to some degree. There's a writer who's written a book that I have to admit I haven't read. It's on my shelf to read, and I'm curious about it for a couple of years now since it came out, by David Loy. I think he's a Zen practitioner, but he's written a book called Ecology. It's gotten very good reviews from that sort of sector of Buddhists who are interested in the environment and working with it. So you might take a look at that book. But this was from an article he did that's called "What Would the Buddha Do?" The most distinctive Buddhist teaching is also the one that gives us the most insight into the collective crises confronting us, the relationship between suffering in the broadest sense and that delusive sense of a self that feels disconnected from others. And when we talk about that ignorance, this is mainly what we're talking about. We tend to think that we're kind of an island unto ourselves, that we've got our own sort of independent existence. And we're just kind of going around in this world, not even being cognizant of the relationships that we do have with other things around us. This is why, again, the understanding of interdependence is so key, because it's actually through an understanding of how things arise in dependence upon other factors that we can come to see the lack of this independent factor. And of course, the Buddha identified this from the very beginning as one of our main problems and something that we need to continually try to address. It can be addressed again at very cursory levels, but it can also be addressed even at much deeper levels through meditation and analysis and what have you. But even in terms of working with the environment, and this was an article that David Loy wrote about the environment, we can see its relevance because it's playing out in terms of the types of causes that we're creating to have this experience. So he says, if a sense of separation is the problem, embracing interdependence must be at the heart of any solution. we have to understand how we are connected to others and how we are connected to the world that we live in. It says interdependence is not merely an insight to be cultivated on our cushions. Instead, we have to live from that. A suffering world calls upon us to realize interdependence, to make it real in the ways we actually live. If Buddhists do not want to do this or cannot find ways to do this, then Buddhism is not the spiritual path that the world needs today. I don't know, maybe that's up for debate. Are we the spiritual path that the world needs? Is there any spiritual path that is what the world needs to confront what we're looking at? But the idea behind it is, and we're going to look at some real practical stuff later tonight, but what does that concept mean to us? What does interdependence mean to us in terms of our action? When we do something, like just even buying something at the store, buying a household cleaner, some sort of product to clean your kitchen. What does that, when thinking about interdependence, cause you to do in regard to that decision? Because we're doing all these things day in and day out, right? We're deciding what to buy, what to eat, where to go. These decisions make a difference. And I think interdependence is a pretty profound concept when we get into understanding the immensity of it, the levels of the way things arise in dependence upon various other factors. But in a very practical way, it should be influencing how we go about living our lives. So this is, again, something we're going to explore a little bit later in terms of more practical things when we get to that part of tonight. So in essence, what we need to have is this kind of understanding of interdependence, of kind of the reality that things are coming into existence based on other factors. And again, we see them at a very deep level in terms of what we're doing with our minds, having a role in creating karma and those experiences. If we begin to get a handle on some of that for ourselves and hopefully influence others, that's great. But there's also very practical things, as I said, in terms of understanding the causal relationships. So he says, the screen says these are mind-little writings when it doesn't have anything attributed. Therefore, we need to have a deep understanding of the interdependence between the environment and the beings within it, as is taught in Buddhism. In fact, in one of the texts that we studied in the master's program when I was in Italy studying is what's called the Abhidharma Kosha. It's a text that's kind of phenomenology. And then I think it's the 4th chapter that talks about karma. The very first verse is, the beings in the world, and this world, and the world itself arise from actions, arise from mind. Because it's, again, through our thoughts that we create the world. Kind of bizarre to think that this entire world, that we have all these theories of evolution and what occurred, that all of this was based on the minds of beings. This next screen, though, alerts us to the other side of it, the other sort of wing that we need to pay attention to. There's also a need to remember the interdependence that exists between one's own well-being and that of others, not just the environment that we live in and all of the interdependence there, but also the fact that we are having an influence on other beings in this world. And that leads to the other essential element of compassion. I think this is where we get kind of the juice from. We have an understanding of what to do through recognizing interdependence and studying and knowing. This is a role that we should take on seriously as Buddhist practitioners, is understanding what role our actions do play in causing climate crisis to be worse, right? To have an effect on things because of the choices that we're making, the decisions that we're making. We also need to have this heart connection. This is a lot of what I'm going to emphasize tonight, is to know that all of our actions need to come from a place of compassion and understanding, and recognize that there are beings who are having, profound suffering because of what has happened in this world. Again, they also have the karma to create that. I'm not saying that they're free of that they're sort of innocent beings that, but that isn't an excuse, or it's merely an explanation. And we simply want to have compassion because we understand that this is the mechanism by which all beings suffer, and according to this process of having minds that are deluded by ignorance, creating karma, and then that karma expressing itself in terms of their experiences. So compassion becomes the response to the reality of interdependence, kind of the heart saying, this is how I need to then react to the world around me. If I am interdependent, not just with the world, but with the beings in it, then I have to be driven by compassion. driven by a concern for the well-being of others. And again, by compassion, we're not just simply sitting on our cushion and saying, oh, I wish the world were free from suffering. I wish beings were free from suffering. It's an active process by which we want to be an agent of freedom to help others to be free from suffering, recognizing we have to work on ourselves first, but we always do that with the motivation of helping others. That, of course, is this Mahayana tradition that we practice in Tibetan Buddhism, as well as Zen Buddhism and Thich Nhat Hanh's Vietnamese Zen Buddhism. All of these are rooted in that. And I found it interesting, this little quote that somebody posted on Facebook one time, and this is from an environmental lawyer. His name is Gus Speck. I have no idea what he is beyond that or who he is. He says, I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science, we could address those problems. And that's kind of that side of it that's always like the wisdom side. If we listen to the scientists, if they do the research and they do the testing and they know exactly what to do, well, then we're going to bring the carbon emissions down and we're going to stop this and stop that, and everything's going to go back to a decent level. He says, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. So again, we were talking earlier, and David Boy was saying, well, what does Buddhism have to offer to this crisis that we're facing? Buddhism, this is Buddhism's specialty to some degree. Again, having Buddha said to be an omniscient being, right, and probably has perfect understanding of all the science and what have you. That's not beyond the understanding of the Buddha. But the Buddha's primary role isn't to instill that knowledge in us. It's to instill the heart connection that allows us to overcome those states of mind that have been causing the problems in the first place. The selfishness, the apathy, the greed, all of these things are behind climate change and what we're experiencing. Without a doubt, we can see greed is one of the main factors, right? Everyone wanting more and better. And gosh, they've gotten to a point where it's just, are there enough resources to continue to have all the things that exist in this world? It's certainly not for everyone in this world to have everything, right? We're seeing this in the world that we live in, the depletion of resources and the inability to keep up with all of that. And it's unfortunate that we've gotten to this place, but that's the environmental problem, Gus says. It's not, all these other things. It's the mindsets that are driving all of this. So it's kind of interesting. We see kind of that mindset in the moment of the attachment and the greed and what have you causing these actions. But we also see, again, at a deeper level, this is creating karma and happening in terms of these experiences that we are going through. Right? So if we are to set about achieving external balance, we have to do that through achieving internal balance. This is kind of, again, what Buddhism has to share in terms of the value of these teachings. This is where Buddhism can contribute a great deal towards resolving the crisis we're facing. If we really are attentive to this and try to instill that in others, which is hard. I mean, again, it's hard enough to work on ourselves. That's, again, what this path is all about. We work on ourselves to be better emissaries and ambassadors of these sorts of thoughts with other people. But it's hard to change other people. I don't have an ability to just say, yes, you're going to do this now, and they're going to immediately follow our advice. So His Holiness, in this other talk he gave, he says, therefore, in order to achieve more effective results and in order to succeed in the protection of the natural environment, it is also important to bring about internal balance within human beings themselves. And one of what we could say is the Buddhist specialty is to cause balance in our own minds, to be able to be free of what is afflicting our minds, to have a mind that is calm and not producing these sorts of causes and conditions, and thereby having a different experience in this world. And we may not see the effects of some of these actions immediately, but those actions that we do, we're going to be examining shortly, can have some bearing on the world that we live in and what's happening. So essentially then we've got two main elements. Again, we often call these the two wings of a bird. Venerable Rabina uses this almost all the time in almost every talk she has. It's from a teaching, Buddhist teaching, that in order for the bird to fly to the island of enlightenment, we need first the wing of wisdom. This is the wing that sees clearly the interdependence of all things, and nothing exists independently. There are many levels of wisdom and understanding. but this is the primary one, to see that there is nothing that is independently existing, that everything exists in connection with other factors. Secondly, the compassion which opens the heart to embrace the welfare of all beings within that view of interdependence. Because if we see that others depend upon us and we depend upon them, and we are caught up in this symbiotic relationship with the world and all the beings in it, then how can we ignore it? Ignoring them is ignoring ourselves. If we have any concern for ourselves, we will care for them. That's why His Holiness often calls that being wisely selfish, right? That we have to actually think that from that vantage point, that when we are working for the benefit of others, we're actually also working for our own good. So while wisdom and compassion inform our response to climate change and other problems in our world, the challenges we face can seem insurmountable. And I think this year has been, for me, one of the hardest to kind of sit through and watch so much of what's going on. He says the challenges we face can seem insurmountable, so we may need other additional tools to keep our hearts open and our intentions strong. This is what we're going to look at in a moment. I do want to take it off screen because maybe many of you also read the article in the Times about in Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were. This was the cradle of civilization, right? I don't know if you saw that article. It was so depressing. You read this and you kind of understand that now this is just a barren wasteland. People are having to evacuate it. They cannot sustain life there. There's not enough water. It's completely dried out. What rivers that are there, just trickles of water. It's just become really horrific. It's quite eye-opening because I don't know how far it is from the equator, but it's not that far. It's kind of a pretty hot temperate zone. You've got that sort of climate that has been causing a lot of problems in various parts of the world, and that's one of them. So it's kind of this really sad reflection on our times, that where civilization grew from, this kind of Garden of Eden, is now this dried up wasteland. Very symbolic. So there are those times where, again, it can seem insurmountable. It can seem like, oh my gosh, what are we doing? Might as well just give up. But my message tonight, and the message that Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston share in their book, is that we need to keep having hope. So let's take a look at the slides that I want to share on this. And I try not to share too much of like other people's writings and stuff, but this is what inspired me to do this talk initially. When I read their book, I felt like this was the answer, and I just wanted to send copies to all of my friends and like get everybody to read this book and kind of have this huge shift. So they suggest that we use this tool of what they call active hope. So what is active hope? Passive hope is about waiting for external agencies to bring about what we desire. I think this is what we've been kind of working with to a large degree in most of the developed world, is we're kind of like, we keep thinking, somebody's going to come to our rescue, and we just kind of have to wait long enough, and then Superman's going to save the day, or whatever the case might be. Somehow we hope for it, but we're not really being an active participant in that, at least to the degree that perhaps we should, at least to affect change. Active hope, she says, is about becoming active participants in bringing about what we hope for. Of course, it's also very different from what we normally call hope, which is, where we only have hope perhaps for the things that we feel are attainable, right? Sometimes we say, oh, I hope that happens, but then we can put energy into it and make the changes necessary, and it actually comes to be. We're going to look at this idea of active hope also being there, even when we have these insurmountable forces, and even when we think that it's not necessarily going to come to pass, even when the vision we were holding tonight as we did our meditation may not be here, that may not be a reality, but nonetheless, we can still hold that vision. There's something miraculous that happens when we are able to keep our minds in that place of having that strong intention in spite of whatever the results might be. This is something we're going to be exploring around this concept of active hope. So active hope is a practice like Tai Chi or gardening or yoga or whatever it is you do. It is something we do rather than have. I think this is the other thing about active hope. It's a doing, it's not a having. I just want to have this kind of, when I wake up in the morning and have a hope that this goes on and the world changes and whatever. It's a process, she says, which we can apply to any solution and situation. And it involves 3 steps. I'm sharing these with you because I think this is really an important part of the process. First, we take a clear view of reality. I think we've been doing that to some degree tonight, but There's much more information beyond what I've shared with you tonight, but also, of course, the Buddhist view of reality, understanding why we're in this predicament, the environmental lawyer's perspective on it, that all of these things that are driving the problem with the environment are the states of mind that we have. Second, we identify what we hope for in terms of the direction we'd like things to move in, or the values we'd like to see expressed. That's that holding vision, right? If we have that idea of what it is that we are really committed to, a world that is healed, a world that is living in harmony and balance, the beings in it and the world that we live in, the environment, kind of complementary to each other rather than in opposition to each other. Third, we then take steps to move ourselves or our situation in that direction. So again, active hope isn't just sitting there going, yeah, I hope everyone figures it all out. But I hope, the leaders of the countries get together and they put another, Paris agreement together or whatever needs to be done. So it's something at the Guardian earlier today that was essentially about how they're saying now that if we don't completely get rid of petroleum products, oil, and all of what's happening through the CO2 release from that is pretty much gone. We have to do this like almost immediately. Are we going to sit around and wait for these leaders to do this? I mean, yes, we can contribute to that. We'll look at that idea as well. But there are things we can do right now, things that each of us can do that will have some bearing, some effect. So the context for understanding the role of active hope is set out in terms of what they call the three stories of our time. We all like a good story, right? Story time when we were kids was always a special time. But she says that essentially there are three main stories that are going on in our world. We might say that there are more, but I think these, in terms of what's happening with our environment, encapsulate most of what's going on, the stories that people are telling themselves or that they're buying into. Number one is business as usual. Of course, we know what that is, right? This is the tendency that we have of most of the people in this world, I would say, probably the large portion, just kind of going on with blinders, saying, I'm not going to pay much attention to it. It's too depressing. It's too awful. I'm just going to keep business as usual. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing and driving my car here and there and doing whatever, because that's just what's coming from that mind. Very selfish mind, right? That's behind all of that. Really thinking about me, myself, and I, and what I need. Right? So the other one, the second one, I'll put these all three on the screen in a moment, is what's called the great unraveling. This is the kind of the other side of it, where you become hyper aware of what's going on. And you think that, oh, the whole world's just going to hell in a handbasket, right? And you buy into this story that it's inevitable that complete ruin is going to happen. This planet's going to just totally, life won't exist on it anymore. At least human life perhaps won't exist on it anymore. And so that's got some credibility to it as well, right? We're not saying that either any of these stories are the right story. It's just which story are you going to subscribe to? These are the two that we tend to vacillate between, right? I think I just keep going on and then we kind of pay attention to it and we go, oh my God, this is horrible. And we just kind of want to hide our head in the sand, not even pay attention anymore. Well, she's proposing, and Chris Johnson as well, Joanna Macy and Chris Johnson are proposing a third story. The story is called The Great Turning, and I'm going to let her words, their words, describe this, because this was what really inspired me when I read this book. I was like, this is the vision that I want to hold. This is the story I want to be subscribing to, that I want to be telling to myself and to others. So the Great Turning is the central plot is finding and offering our gift of active hope. So we already spoke about active hope and what it is. This is about finding that within ourselves and offering that to the world, living from that place of active hope. Involving the emergence of new and creative human responses, it is about the epochal transition from an industrial society committed to economic growth to a life-sustaining society committed to the healing and recovery of our world. So is anyone ready to sign up for that story already, just on that one screen? When you just hear those words, they're very inspiring, right? It's like, that's the story I want to subscribe to, that I want to be telling, that I want to be a part of, is a movement away from what we've been doing for however many centuries into a different type of world where we think in terms of that, think about how we sustain life through our actions, how we actually don't deplete resources, but help things to recover and heal. So there are three dimensions to this, and I think all three of these we can see, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these as we go into some more practical advice at the end. We have three things that have kind of a dimension to this great turning. They're all happening simultaneously and they do mutually reinforce each other. In fact, in the book, they had them as kind of like a wheel spinning around. Each one does affect the other one. The very first one is holding actions. Holding actions are the things that we do to keep more harm from happening. It's kind of interesting how a lot of this kind of follows a Buddhist presentation of morality, right? First, we have to stop doing the harm. First, we have to stop inflicting harm on ourselves and others. Secondly, we have to do life-sustaining systems and practices. This means that we have to have more investment in our own choices that we're making and those things that are actually helping the environment, that are actually complementary to some growth and recovery in this world, and not to just economic growth and depleting of resources and what have you. We have to make a conscious choice to do the things that are beneficial. This is kind of like the second level of our morality of practicing virtuous actions, right? Creating the kind of energy behind that. It is all about thinking of others with both that understanding of interdependence as well as the motivation of compassion. So that we're even bringing compassion into the decisions that we make and trying to support those systems and practices that will help the world to recover. The third is shifts in consciousness, which again, in a morality thing, we could say this is maybe that whole idea of going beyond just virtuous deeds to really think about the ultimate benefit to all beings and how we can contribute to that. To have real shifts in our thinking, to see this, and this was again where I when I read this book initially, it was so inspiring. To see this as an incredible opportunity. We talk in Tibetan Buddhism a lot about this concept of transforming problems into happiness into the path. Well, and the idea behind that is that the Bodhisattva wants these opportunities in their life. Why? Because those Bodhisattvas want to use that as grist for the mill. It's kind of the manure that becomes the fertilizer. It becomes something that helps us. There's a wonderful book title by Thich Nhat Hanh called No Mud, No Lotus, right? Without all of that really deep stuff that you can sink your teeth into and work with, it's very hard to grow the mind sort of exponentially. Everything that goes well in our lives, if we have kind of this idyllic sort of lifestyle, well, then we never get challenged with it. If we have lots of problems in our life, we should actually be rejoicing and saying, oh, good, I have stuff to work with. Well, this is the shift in consciousness, is to really see that what we are about here is one of the most important moments in human history. I mean, this period. If we don't make some conscious choices to change our awareness individually and collectively, again, it can be the end of this planet and the life on this planet. We could go that far, absolutely, without a doubt. But we can use this shift in consciousness to actually open to that reality and understand that through the understanding of interdependence, compassion, and so on, we can actually create a different world. We can have a different world for not just our life, but for the generations that are coming. It's that wonderful product that the seventh generation. I use some of their products. They say that they do all their products with the concept of 7 generations out. Of course, doesn't mean they don't want to help generations of the 8th and 9th or whatever. They want to think in those terms, right? That's a lot of what we want to do in terms of the decisions that we make. So I've got some additional suggestions, for your great turning. These are some things that I actually I've gotten a lot of involvement, not like intimate involvement, but I get involved with a lot of their campaigns. Interfaith Power and Light. They have a branch in New Mexico through in Albuquerque. A wonderful Catholic Sister Joan Brown. She's the main coordinator there, and they sent out this sort of 4-part thing of what are the more practical things that are about those sorts of decisions, right? How do we engage in more holding actions? How do we do things that are actually more life-sustaining? How do we have shift in consciousness to some degree? These are perhaps the first 2 more than they are the last one. You can see Buddhism, again, has a lot to offer in regard to the third one. But the very first one is do your part. Do your part. What does this mean? It means that we each individually have to make these sorts of decisions. These have been put together in a very personal way by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnson in their book. They call them the Eco-Sattva vows. We actually have those available on the internet for those who would like to get a copy, excuse me. The Shantideva Center has kindly put them there, and you can access them through the link. I don't know if the link was when they registered, or was it? Yeah. So anyway, you can obtain that. And if by chance you are watching this at a later time, by all means, get in touch with Shantideva Center or myself through my website, and I'll be happy to make these available to you. We've got a set of these, what they're called the Eco-Sattva vows. Sattva, the word bodhisattva, just means a being. So Eco-Sattva is a being who is concerned about the ecology, who is living from their heart and trying to be involved in changing things. This is the very first of the Eco-Sattva. By the way, these Eco-Sattva vows, they're called vows, but this doesn't mean that when you take these, you break them if you do something and you have to confess them and all. I don't think we want to take that degree of seriousness around the word vow. These are commitments. These are like personal statements that we want to be telling ourselves and living from. First of all, I vow to myself and to each of you to commit myself daily to the healing of our world and the welfare of all beings. Of course, in Buddhism, we do that through cultivating bodhicitta motivation to some degree. But this is also more specifically about that I want to be conscious and aware, have that carefulness throughout my day so that my decisions are in accord with this idea, and that I'm being heedful and kind of paying attention. Secondly, to live on earth more lightly and less violently in the food, products, and energy that I consume. This is a big one. I mean, when you think about all the stuff that we consume in the matter of a year, how many decisions, again, that we make in terms of what sort of products we buy, where those products come from, to what degree is energy involved in some of those things. Like, I find it kind of outrageous when we look at what goes on in this country in terms of us getting so spoiled to have certain fruit and produce, at all times of the year, right? We're not satisfied with a seasonal kind of approach to things. You want to get them from Argentina, you want to get them from New Zealand, and you want to get them from all these countries. That takes energy, right? Those things don't just magically appear in your grocery store. They come from those decisions that we are all making to buy those things off season, right? To not be seasonal in how we approach things. In the past, generations before us didn't have this, right? They didn't have apples in the winter or summer. I mean, they would normally store them through the winter and have them from the fall harvest. And then eventually they'd be depleted, and then they would work with the things that were there in spring, what came in summer, and they had harvest, and they had a cycle to life. So much more connection to the earth. We're living now where everything we buy tends to be, you might get it from a farmer's market, but it's still at some sort of collected place and what have you. We're not living off the land in the ways that we used to. And of course, so many other cultures, even the indigenous cultures in this world, have much greater knowledge and awareness of how to do that. We've lost that knowledge in most of our developed countries, right? And so we need to be conscious now, at least about what we are buying and how we are sustaining our own lives, so that we can be making more conscious decisions. So here are some few things that came from this wonderful film. I don't know if you saw it, Before the Flood. Leonardo DiCaprio was the sponsor of this, executive producer or whatever, and then he also was a narrator through much of it. The first one, consume differently in what you buy, what you eat, and how you get your power. Of course, again, when you're living in New York City, perhaps it might be hard to make some of these decisions around what do you do? Where do you go? How do you actually manage that? But nonetheless, you can talk to the stores that you go to see where they get the products that they have, especially with food. Again, I can't believe what's all involved in shipping food all over this world. If you eat locally, of course, you have much less impact on the environment. Many of you have the ability to grow some of what you eat. If you do, that's a wonderful way, again, to be able to cut down on some of what happens in this world. The products that you buy, be aware of where they come from. To what degree are we contributing to environmental issues once more through products that are produced in other countries, and mining things in various parts of the world where they're depleting resources and what have you, and causing environmental harm. How you get your power. I don't know what Con Edison. It's Con Edison is the big one here, right? I don't know how conscious they've become around this. In New Mexico, I think we've had pretty good luck with PNM and New Mexico Gas Company. Like PNM in particular has tried to move away from coal. They've got one plant left and move towards wind and solar. But, you know, many people are getting solar panels and putting them on their rooftops or wherever they can, you know, to be able to at least you know, have some impact on the environment. Of course, if you have a car vehicle, it's good to buy something that's at least hybrid, if not electric, but there too. And where's the electricity come from? The electricity is coming from coal, where you're not necessarily, you know, having the best impact. But if we think in those terms, whenever we're kind of going about doing something, well, then we make perhaps some different decisions. Maybe we can't decide to get rid of everything that's harmful in some way, but we at least are conscious about what we're doing. And that level of consciousness makes a difference. The third of the Ecological vows is to draw strength and guidance from the living earth, the ancestors, the future generations, and my brothers and sisters of all species. What's that look like? I don't know, I struggle with that one myself, but I think again, to hold the awareness that this knowledge is here. There's this concept that, right, that if we created this problem, then we have the knowledge to solve this problem. You know, to some degree, this is true, right? You know, it's human minds that have created all this, not just through karma again, but through what we have done. It's human minds that also can, you know, figure out how to get us back to the garden, if you will, you know, to actually solve all of this. And I think that there's also a lot of knowledge and wisdom in the indigenous cultures I mentioned earlier that have, I'd like to certainly see more of them in charge of things. I had real high hopes for Deb Holland, who was the this her position Interior Department of the Interior now for Biden. She's from New Mexico. She was a representative from New Mexico, and she's Native American. And I just thought, wow, this is the right person to be in charge of the Department of the Interior. But I haven't seen the kind of revolutionary things I wanted from her. But again, maybe that's that passive hope, you know, like expecting that because someone gets in the office that they're suddenly going to do that. But there is the wisdom out there. There's a knowledge out there. And I think we just have to draw strength and guidance from that. Really know that the answers are out there. And then to support others in our work for the world and to ask for help when I get to it. I think this is important to recognize that we're not in this alone. You know, as we've been stressing, there's interdependence, but there's also the fact that you have so many people that are committed to doing something about the environment. Maybe a lot more that aren't, but that can change. Yeah, can get that tipping point. I think they say something like, I don't remember the exact number, but it was something quite insignificant. They said to have a sort of global shift in things, it doesn't take like 51%. You would think it would, right? You have to get over that majority. It only takes like 4 or 5%. Because if you have that level of people that are committed, the changes start happening and the sort of inertia begins, and you have this process that starts with just that small a portion of the population. So, you know, we can be in this together. That was the slogan through the COVID thing, right? We're all in this together. We're all in this together. I had kind of hopes, maybe it was a bit of more of a passive hope, that as we came out of that there would be more awareness, right? People would actually be understanding the degree to which they are interdependent with others. That was really clear to me as we were going about those months in isolation and depending upon people who still were going to work to sell the groceries, to pack the shelves, to do whatever that was involved in our being able to have a nice life through all of that. You know, we should have gotten the message then. Maybe we haven't gotten it quite fully. But also perhaps the message of slowing down and simplifying our lives. You know, we don't need all the things that we have. Maybe many of you have already done that. Simplify your life to where it's not, things are not so important. Again, that's not a Buddhist teaching, but it's a helpful aid to be able to not have so many things in our life for our own lives. But it's also, of course, something that can be a benefit to the world that we live in, not consuming so many things. So, and we all struggle with some of these various things, but nonetheless, these Ecological vows, again, you can find the copy that's on the internet. Maybe just put that somewhere where you can occasionally look at that and see to what degree are you living in accord with those sorts of ideas. Another thing that we can do is vote for leaders who will fight climate change by ending fossil fuel subsidies, investing in renewables, leaving fossil fuels in the ground, supporting a price on carbon. Well, these are all things that are kind of going on in the political world, maybe not to the degree we'd like them to. And they're talked about. Unfortunately, we're dealing with kind of a stalemate in Congress right now with an inability to do a whole lot to affect some of these changes. But again, if we vote for the leaders who will actually get in and do these sorts of things to stop what's happening, well, depletion of resources and what have you, and putting more and more CO2 into the environment, well, then let's do that. Know who you're voting for. So that's another thing that is definitely a part of that idea. The previous one, supporting others in our work, ask for help when I need it, is to actually, recognize that we can be part of a movement of change in terms of those politicians that are committed to these sorts of ideals. And then this is the last of the Eckosattva vows. I almost call them the Bodhisattva vows. I vow to myself and to each of you to pursue a daily practice that clarifies my mind, strengthens my heart, and supports me in observing these vows. I guess I would ask each of you to just reflect, for a moment. Does the daily practice you have, if you're Buddhist, and most of us have a daily practice, does it do this? Does it clarify your mind? Does it strengthen your heart? Does it support you in this type of work, in observing those vows? And if it doesn't, then maybe you need to work on your practice to actually have it be something that complements what you're trying to do. A lot of us do have commitments where we just kind of are reciting all sorts of things that we need to every day because we made a commitment to doing that. Well, are you doing that with that kind of awareness? Is it something that helps to clarify your mind? And so I think these are all things that pertain to the very first of these suggestions. Again, this wasn't part of what New Mexico Interfaith Power and Light sent on. They just had these 4 things, and they didn't really go into much detail. But I'm fleshing them out in terms of things from Buddhism, as well as other things that I've learned. Second, share what you know. There are a lot of people still that are very ignorant of what's going on in our world, or choose to be ignorant about what's going on in our world, right? Who don't really want to open their eyes to that reality. People may not want to hear what's going on, but it is important that you share what you know. And even sharing these concepts, like this idea of the great turning, that's an amazing, inspiring thing for some people to do. It might not be just anybody you meet on the street, when you start talking about it on the subway or something, and somebody might, think strange things about you. But if you know people and think that they can be influenced by these, then share what you know. Because this is, once more, if we get to that critical mass of whatever percentage it is, then change does start happening at a much wider level. The third one is to get involved. And I think that we do have our challenges with this. David Loy had that, quote about our separate self earlier. Insofar as a sense of separate self is the basic problem, right? Compassionate commitment to the well-being of others, including other species, is an important part of the solution. All of our actions should be coming from that place of wanting to do what comes out of a concern for others. We're included in that. When we're doing things for others, as I said, we're also doing them for ourselves. We're also doing it to increase our own well-being. So all the actions that we do should be coming out of this sense of dedication to the well-being of all. Engagement with the world's problems is therefore not a distraction from our personal spiritual practice, but can become an essential part of it. Now, I have to be completely honest with you, as somebody who has not been a big activist in my life, be out there to this parade or that march or whatever occasionally, but I wasn't really, I can't consider myself to be one of those people who engaged in civil disobedience and got chained to, was chained to some place that is a nuclear power plant or whatever and got arrested. I don't have an arrest record or any of that stuff. And so I have an issue sometimes with like that level of commitment to being active in that way. But it was a few years back, right? It was probably during the Trump administration when I was involved in it. But I recognized that we all choose what part we want to play in those sorts of things. We don't all have to be the person holding the sign and chaining ourselves to the nuclear plant or whatever the case might be, right? But we still can support that idea and that, and again, do whatever it takes. Now, again, many people think, well, if I just sign enough of these online petitions, well, then I'm doing my part. I mean, do the online petitions, but I don't know that the online petitions really change things that much. but I think they're a part of it. They're a part of like this energy and creating this wish, that this active hope that we need to do something, and we need to hold that vision of what the world looks like. I think they even did a little skit on Saturday Night Live about some guy who changed the whole world just by signing petitions from his computer at home or something, giving him credit for changing the whole world. So I don't know if that really works, but nonetheless, do it, because it does make a difference. It makes a difference in terms of your thinking and your desire to have that come true. To say, yes, I want a world where we don't have any more subsidies for oil industry. I want a world where we don't do any more fossil fuel extraction. So this is how we actually, again, make a change, is by engaging in those actions, getting involved in things as much as we can. The last of these four is be the difference. Have we already passed ecological tipping points, and civilization as we know it is doomed? We don't know, and that's okay. Of course, we hope our efforts will bear fruit, but ultimately they are our open-hearted gift to the world. This is how I interpreted be the difference, is like, be the person who cares. Be the person who actually will do something. I was talking to someone earlier today who said that they saw somebody walking on the street here in Brooklyn, and they dropped something, just like, they didn't drop it, they threw it on the ground, trash. And so her thing is that she picks it up and she goes to them and says, "Hey, you dropped something." And giving them the benefit of the doubt that they must have just dropped it, not thrown it away on the street. It's a small thing, right? But it shows that you're the one that cares. You're the one that cares whether there's trash on the street or whatever the case might be. Again, trash on the street isn't our main problem in the world right now, but it's part of it, right? Because we see that this mentality of pollution, of just using things, of being negligent of things, is contributing. The more people that we can have an influence on by being the difference, being the person who cares, the person who says, yes, this isn't okay. Maybe we can have an influence on somebody that we know who's going to buy a car. They say, "Oh, I'm really looking at this gas guzzler or whatever this thing is, just they still make these things. It's outrageous, right? That just eat up gas like crazy." And you might tell them, have you considered something that's a hybrid, a smaller car, or whatever? And they might give you a zillion excuses, but keep telling them, well, why do you need that? Why do you need that? Again, I think this is how we actually will see some change, because each of us who are committed at a deeper level, whatever, again, degree we feel we are, to have an effect on others. There's one thing I want to add to this. This was the 4-point list that I got from Interfaith Power and Light. And that's this idea of bringing joy to all. I don't know if I taught this when I was here previously. There's a wonderful book that perhaps you've read or encountered called The Book of Joy. The Book of Joy is His Holiness and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who also just passed away recently. The two of them in dialogue. A man named Douglas Abrams, I think is his name, in Dharamsala for about 5 days. And they really focus on this idea of joy and where joy comes from. And by joy, they don't just mean like a sense of elation that we might have occasionally seeing something delightful. They mean a more sustaining kind of joy. And within that book, there are what are called the 8 pillars of joy, that are all these sorts of attitudes and thoughts and things that we want to bring into our life that really influence us in a very positive way to have a more joyful life. I think if we're the miserable person who's engaging in all of this, trying to fight what's going on, well, then it's not going to be much fun for us, but it's also not going to be very attractive to others. They talk about this actually in that book, how we want to kind of live from this spirit of joy. If that's what we give, that's our gift to the world, is to be this joyful presence in the world. And even most environmental activists that I see, yes, it's very difficult work, and it can be like banging your head against the wall because change is so slow and coming if it comes at all. But they still have this, what's driving. I remember Venerable Rubina when she was in Santa Fe a few years back. There was one person who was in that kind of occupation of being an environmental activist and doing a lot of things. And she was speaking to the really depressing side of it. It's just really, really hard. And she just cries every day because it's just, this is what she's committed to. But it's like, no change, nothing's happening. But then Urbina pointed out, dying, this isn't the way we're going to kind of get it all done. We have to kind of have this enthusiasm and exuberance that carries through all of that. And I think that this is something, again, we're going to talk about this more on Sunday. Sunday, I'm going to be here doing a little workshop on secular ethics, how to live a good life through having awareness of what secular ethics is. It's not completely secular, I'll give you an advance warning, because it's the Dalai Lama's view of secular ethics. So it does have some of these same concepts. But his idea is that, again, whether we get the result that we're seeking or not isn't as important as the intention and motivation that we bring. And if we bring this kind of compassionate, joyous, wise mind to it, then what result we get isn't as important as the energy that we put into it. I think we saw this with active hope, right? It's not so much what the final outcome is. It's what are we doing in the process? What is it that we're doing with our own minds and the actions that follow from that? So I want to share a few words that have to do with this idea of kind of bringing joy into what we do from the Dalai Lama, from one of, again, another of his environmental talks. Actually, this is a whole book that came out when he was at the conference that was up in Portland that was sponsored by Maitripa College, the FPMT. There was a book that I haven't gotten through all of it either. It's just there's so many books out there that you only have so many time to read. There's so much time to read, right? One important practice is continuously making an effort to cultivate joy. Even in my own life, if I look at progress over short periods of time, there isn't always something to be joyful about. Maybe even we look at our own Buddhist practice, we might think, gosh, I don't see any revolutionary changes. What's keeping me doing my meditation and all the practice I do? But if I look over a decade or 2 decades, then there is tremendous joy, or tremendous room for joy. This is true with the environmental movement too. There are many areas where environmentalists have had tremendous success. I mean, it might be hard to point to a number of them, but certainly we do see some, right, where things have begun to change in a much more positive direction. The emphasis that's been put on, particularly our automobiles and all of this, and trying to get everything away from fossil fuels, which is hard. It's taking a long time, right? We don't have it like instantly. It's not like immediately we have all of these vehicles that are with the electrical, what have you. So the one other thing I want to share, which I don't have a slide for, but one quote from Joanna Macy, she says, of all the dangers we face, from climate change to nuclear war, none is so great as the deadening of our response. And I think this is really the message that I want to make sure that we all hear tonight, try to practice, is to recognize that we do have to stay actively engaged in the world, regardless of what's going on, regardless of how hopeless it seems. Active hope isn't buying into that idea. Active hope is saying, I'm going to do the work anyway. It's not wasted. None of what we do is ever wasted, right? No matter what the results are. I'm not saying you shouldn't pay attention to the results. We're going to look at that on Sunday too. The idea that we need an element of wisdom that is aware of what we're doing so that we make sure that the results, at least there's a potential for the outcome that we're aiming for. But even when we think that it's hopeless in that way, we still have the hope to continue to create this pattern, to continue to create what we want to see in the world, what we want to see in our own hearts and minds. So I did want to share this wonderful little video, but I want to take questions first, just in case, because I don't want to show a video and then have like 5 or 6 questions, and then we end up going over and what have you. So if I don't share it, you can certainly watch it on your own at YouTube. It's a very inspiring little story. Joanna Macy telling the story of the Shambhala warrior of prophecy. That may have watched this video, but it's really quite nice the way she tells it. Any questions from tonight, either online? If you do have a question online, we can hear you in the Gompa if you unmute and ask your question. If you have any in the Gompa, yeah, stay. Oh, we need a mic. Yeah, so that the folks on home can.
I was just thinking about, so many places around the world have these water wars where, because we're talking about interdependence. So the same river is running, like we see it in California and
Colorado.
India, Colorado, like all these countries where people know that downstream they're suffering because the dams are built or they're just diverting too much water for their own irrigation and farms, knowing that people downstream will not have enough water. And it still doesn't move them like to ration or allocate or come to some agreement. It just leads to fighting or just repairing. And then I think like, what does it take to? I mean, they're not oblivious of interdependence. They know.
Mhm.
They just don't care.
They just don't care.
Yeah.
I mean, this is when they said apathy earlier, David Boy in his comment. I think this is one of the biggest problems we have here. I mean, there was an article I read recently about the apathy we saw during the pandemic. That, people, I mean, I don't want to be down on the anti-vax and the anti-mask people. But if you look at what was going on there, in a normal situation, right, when you have a cold, you generally stay home or you cover your mouth or do something to keep other people from getting it. And during the pandemic, there were a lot of people who didn't have that awareness of like, I can infect other people with that behavior I'm engaging in. It's a similar sort of thing, right? It's just that not caring about others, not caring about one's own actions and the negative effect that they have on others. I don't know. It's definitely a product of kind of the evolution of negative thinking in this world, that we've gotten to a place where the selfishness and the greed and so many other factors have become really huge, and they have this side effect of a lack of concern for other people. In Buddhist terms, we would say that definitely this is an extension of our selfishness, right? Because we're only thinking about me, myself, my environment, my community, the people that I care about, and to hell with everybody else. If they don't get enough water, if they don't, if they get COVID, if whatever, I don't care about them.
On the happy side, I mean, there are many also good stories I read about people. One man, like in India, like in some village, just took some arid land and just decided to plant trees, and over 20 years
Right.
now, forest.
Yeah.
And on a more personal thing, I don't know if George mentioned that since you were here last time, he's put clover.
So wonderful.
Something in your home. Yeah,
Yeah.
like
That's all.
so
That's wonderful.
there are
Yeah.
there are little things to
Sure,
help and
sure. And that's when we talked earlier about kind of, sharing what we know with others. It's sharing these stories too. I mean, to like inspire people in more positive ways to say, yeah, are people making progress? There are things happening. I think that was part of what his Dalai Lama was saying too. Over time, you'll see the effects of all of these things. Maybe not soon enough, maybe not fast enough, but nonetheless, these are the things that we need to also highlight in our world. It's not always tell the negative story. This is the culture we live in too, right? And when you watch the news, how many of the stories that you get that one little piece of news at the end sometimes on the national news, right? They go, yeah, not a blighter road or whatever, after they've been telling you all this depressing news for the last 25 minutes. So you get maybe one little morsel of something good that's really big. And the environmental story is really important to hear about. If somebody's making a difference. These do make a difference. One less person consuming energy through this building, other buildings, what have you.
I mean, many states in India have banned plastic. It's a huge thing. And people
Sure.
just adapted to paper or bring their own bags.
Yeah. And I've been seeing some cities that want to go back to having plastic bags again. So that kind of thing. And it goes, wow, did we really come that far only to revert to like this really silly, childish way of kind of dealing with things? We can all remember when we first started bringing our own bags, right? Bringing reusable bags, all of that, And it wasn't that big a deal, right? And initially people were like, oh, I'm going to carry bags into the grocery store. What for? I'm going to give them bags. Yeah, yeah, all those things that were in the film, An Inconvenient Truth, changing lights, to LED, rather than incandescent. And these things do make a difference. Yeah, the more people that do this, the bigger the effect. That's more individuals like you. It's not like a whole bunch of other people. It's you and all those people. So, yes.
I think though that's why Joanna Macy says that you have to be engaged because little things are not going to change the system. But maybe in 1,000 years, but we don't have 1,000 years. You know, in that sense, that's, I forget who said it, but someone said that a small group of committed people can change the world or
Right.
something. I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds familiar to me too.
Yeah, yeah. So, really, let's aim, we have to keep our eyes open,
Yeah,
keep our eyes open to what levels we can effect change.
Yeah. yeah, no, and I agree. I mean, it is hard to see when just one simple small thing is done, how it can't have possibly that huge an effect. When you have many people doing that one small thing,
For sure.
that's where, and I think that that's again, when you can kind of feel like we're part of a movement, which is what I felt when I first read that book. I was like, this is again the story I want to buy into. This is what I want to be living to, and this is how I want to go about being a part of the solution to all this. I'm not again a scientist, so can't be involved at that level of coming up with new ways of getting power or all these various things that are going on in the world. But I can certainly keep my awareness and knowledge as best as I can and make decisions in accordance.
I really appreciate the fact that we're having this teaching today, because I haven't encountered it, that much.
Yeah.
And Buddhism, and I think it's very refreshing.
Oh, good.
Talk about it all.
Yeah. No, and that article on tricycle was even along those lines of like saying, why aren't Buddhists talking about this more? Is it that we get caught up in this idea of like, oh, this is samsara, we're about, we want to leave this all behind. This isn't the promised land per se, but samsara and nirvana, as much as we point to this external word, it's more a state of mind. I mean, this is what we mean by samsara and nirvana, whether your mind is still under the control of all these factors or whether you're free of all these factors. So this is what we have to work with, folks. This is the grist from the mill. This is the mud that the lotus comes from. If we don't want to work with this, well, then what do we do? So I really do agree that we don't talk about it enough in Buddhist circles. I'm glad to see many Buddhist writers now getting out there and saying things, writing things. This holiness, of course, being a big component for a lot of this. And I myself go through my own questioning. And part of my not traveling as much, even with the pandemic over, is I do feel like I don't want to be as much of a contributor to all of that. As I was telling that same person earlier that I was talking about earlier today, I know the plane's going to fly whether that one seat is filled with me or someone else. I don't have any delusions about that. I'm not stopping a plane by flying, by choosing not to fly all around the world, countries, whatever. It feels weird to be a part of it. And yet I still do, but I try to just cut back into as much as I can. I really do like the concept of online teachings. I know that everyone's kind of moving back to wanting more in person, but it becomes this little battle. And what is really good? What is really best? I don't know that we're at I don't know where we're at in regard to a tipping point. I think we may have exceeded the tipping point, but all these things will still have some bearing, not one, the future. Thank you. Any questions from anyone online or? Were there any in the chat box? I can really check. Let me check in the chat box. Are there any questions? Well, I'm gonna let it up to you. It's about 9. Well, coming up on 9 o'clock. Do we want to watch the video together? It's about 10, just under 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Okay, those of you who don't want to watch, you're certainly welcome to just exit, stage left, whatever. There it is. It's reappeared now. Okay, let me go back to Zoom. That's great. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I've got it all set up to share. Before I do this, I'm going to make sure I get the video up. Go to that page, that'll be better. And then let me do the screen share. I've got it with the sound on. So if you can't hear the sound by any chance, please let Sunny know, and we'll make sure that I think you should be able to see and hear It was wonderful.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Active Hope Show. I'm Chris Johnston, and with my co-author Joanna Macy, we wrote Active Hope to draw together insights and practices that help us give our best response to the crisis of sustainability unfolding in our world. One of the core insights is that our ability to respond is shaped by the stories woven into our view of reality. If we want to be empowered and inspired, we need stories that are empowering and inspiring. So here Joanna tells one that we both draw strength from.
I'd like to tell you a prophecy from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. It's called The Coming of the Kingdom of Shambhala, and it is 12 centuries old. This is a particular version of the prophecy embedded in the Kalachakra Tantra. And it was given to me by my dear friend, Dharma brother, Dugu Chogyal Rinpoche of the community of Tashijong in India. When I heard it, I realized that the term Shambhala warrior is a metaphor for what in Buddhism is understood to be the Bodhisattva. The Bodhisattva is the hero in the Buddhist tradition. And because the core teaching of the Lord Buddha is the radical inter-existence of all things, if one person has the capacity to be a bodhisattva, then others do too. So let me tell you this prophecy. I'm going to aim it at the bodhisattva inside you. Listen to it as if it were about you, as if you realized it were about you. And I'm giving it to you pretty much in the language I received it from Dugu Chogyal Rinpoche. There comes a time when all life on earth is in danger. At that time, great powers have arisen, barbarian powers. And although they waste their wealth in preparations to annihilate each other, they have much in common. And among the things these powers, these barbarian powers, have in common are weapons of unfathomable devastation and death, and technologies that lay waste the world. And it is just at this point in our history when the future of all beings seems to hang by the frailest of threads that the kingdom of Shambhala emerges. Now you can't go there because it is not a place. It exists in the hearts and minds of the Shambhala warriors. And actually, you can't tell a Shambhala warrior by looking at her or him, because they wear no uniforms, no insignia, they wield no banners, they have no barricades upon which to climb to threaten the enemy or behind which they can rest and regroup. They don't even have any home turf. For the Shambhala warriors have only the terrain of the barbarian powers to move across, to act upon. Now the time is coming, Dugu Chogyal Rinpoche said to me, when great courage is required of the Shambhala warriors. Moral courage and physical courage. And that's because they are going to go right into the heart of the barbarian powers to dismantle their weapons. They're going to go into the pits and citadels where the weapons are made and deployed. They're going to go into the corridors of power where the decisions are made to dismantle the weapons in every sense of the word. Now mark this, said Chujia Rinpoche to me. The Shambhala warriors know that these weapons can be dismantled because they are manomaya. That means mind-made. Made by the human mind, they can be unmade by the human mind. Because the dangers that face us are not brought upon us by some satanic deity or some evil extraterrestrial force or some unchangeable preordained fate. They arise out of our relationships and habits, out of our priorities. They are made by the human mind. They can be unmade by the human mind. So, he said, now is the time the Shambhala warriors go into training. How do they train? I asked. They train in the use of two implements, he said. Actually used the word weapons. What are they? I asked. And he held up his hands the way the dancers hold the ritual objects in the great Lama dances of his people. And he said, one is compassion, and the other is insight into the radical interdependence of all phenomena. And you need both, he said. You need the compassion because that provides the fuel to move you out where you need to be, to do what you need to do. And it means not being afraid of the suffering of your world. And when you're not afraid to be with that pain, then nothing can stop you. You can be and do what you're meant to. But by itself, he said, that implement is very hot. It can burn you out. So you need the other. That other tool, the insight into the radical interconnectivity at the heart of existence. The web of life, our deep ecology. When you have that, you know, he said, when you understand that, then you know that this is not a battle between good guys and bad guys. You know that the line between good and evil runs through the landscape of every human heart. And you know that we are so interwoven in the web of life that even the smallest act with clear intention has repercussions through the whole web beyond your capacity to see. But that's kind of cool, he said. It's maybe even a little abstract, so you need the heat of the compassion. That's the prophecy. And if you've seen Tibetan monks doing chanting with the hand gestures, the mudras moving, likely as not, they are dancing the interplay between compassion and wisdom, which is there for each one of us to embody now in our own way.
Good.
Most people have no clue that in 2023, the best
Going
way to
on
make money
another
on
video. Okay. So I hope you enjoyed that. Oh, it might be a little too loud now with my voice. Yeah, I mean, I've never met her. I would love to meet her someday. I don't know. She's, yeah, in her 90s and she's unstoppable. Just keeps doing the work. But you can see where it comes from, you know, her understanding of Buddhism, Buddhist principles, and how they are informing her work, her desire to be an agent of change in the world. So I hope that inspires you all as well. Let's just do a short dedication again at the end of all of our sessions together. We want to think about, again, we set a strong intention, motivation earlier tonight, kind of our vision of the world that we want to hold to as our own active hope, desire to move in a particular direction, and then that strong intention that all of our actions will be informed by that, will help us to move towards a much healthier, happier world for ourselves and for all beings. We can dedicate with that strong intention, without a doubt, that what we did here tonight will become causes for that result. And may all beings eventually find the complete culmination of compassion and wisdom in their own minds and be able to actualize complete enlightenment. We also dedicate to the good health and long lives of all of our spiritual teachers upon whom we depend, these great guides who inform our path and help us to stay true to these principles. And lastly, we dedicate for any individuals that we might have in our lives that are suffering or dealing with difficult circumstances, obstacles, illness, maybe even those that we know who have died. And to keep our hearts open to their situation, offering this energy that we've created tonight to their well-being. So they will be free from suffering and find all the causes of happiness and peace. And may all beings have happiness and peace through what we have done for tonight. Okay, thank you all for joining. Again, tomorrow I will be here to do a little workshop on forgiveness, the healing power of forgiveness. And then Sunday, as I mentioned earlier, will be the secular ethics. All right, everyone, be well. Have a nice evening. Thank you. Thank you all online. Very welcome. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Don. That was very inspirational. I've been very depressed reading the news and hearing about